So okay. I'm going to start streaming. Then I'll just say go, okay?
Okay, sure.
Okay, you can start.
Okay. Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Syed Ajur Rahman. I'm the regional coordinator of IUFRO Landscape Ecology Working Party. As we know that we have our today's webinar on landscape ecology in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So actually this webinar is very important because we know that ecosystem restoration can prevent, halt, and reverse the loss of ecosystems. It can also help to end poverty, combat climate change. However, the success of this restoration obviously depending on everyone's part to play. All of us, we have to play the part. As the landscape ecology provides an important framework through integration, dimensionality in the analysis of landscape systems, understanding the critical zone processes in both temporal and spatial scale, and investigating the problems of restoration, ecological restoration. Therefore, landscape ecology, we know that can play crucial role to this restoration. And of course, will have a very big, crucial contribution to UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration from this year to until 2030. So actually, our today's webinar is a part of IUFRO. So IUFRO actually stands for, as everybody, most of us know, that International Union of Forest Research Organizations. IUFRO is a global, non-profit, non-governmental, and non-discriminatory scientific organization. IUFRO is open to all individuals and organizations who are dedicated to research related to forest and forest products. IUFRO was founded long ago in 1892 and is now based in Vienna, Austria. It is a member of International Council for Science, ICSU. IUFRO is actually very big. It is a scientific umbrella of the global scientific umbrella. IUFRO has 15,000 scientists, 600 member organizations, 600 voluntary office holders, 250 research units. This is very vast. And we hold 70 meetings plus minus every year. And we are operating 120 countries. So the main mission of IUFRO is to advance research excellence and knowledge sharing and forest development of science-based solutions to forest-related challenges for the benefit of forest and people worldwide. As we are who are involved in forestry, we know that there are lots of challenges and dimensions in forest to address too. So IUFRO has a 5 major research themes. Those are forest for people, forest and climate change, forest and forest-based products for a greener future, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and biological innovations. And the last one is forest, soil, and water interaction. So IUFRO has 9 permanent divisions. Our landscape ecology is under the division 8, which is forest environment, under the unit forest ecosystem functions. We have our coordinator here, João Evangelho from Portugal. We already talked, and we have 3 deputies. Pele Fan from United States. We have Jos Gabi from Argentina, and we have Maria Meja from Colombia. And also we have several regional coordinators like me, operating in different regions. So our working party was created in 1991, especially to bridge the gap between landscape ecology theory and its applications into the management of forest system. Our working party is very active within IUFRO. We are promoting different various events. We have so many publications and other various participation. For example, this year we are promoting tree planting across the globe, coordinated by our working party members. So I'm very sorry, I'm finishing almost. Our last meeting was in Brazil in 2019 during the IUFRO World Congress, and the next one will be next year. We are still discussing which place and date due to COVID, is the situation. So this year we are also celebrating our 30th anniversary, and as part of this is our fourth webinar under emerging issues in landscape ecology. So here we have we have 3 speakers today. Another one is, we have 4 speakers today. We're waiting for Rene. I hope he will come soon. So we have with us Professor Andreas Bolt. He's also head of Thunen Institute of Forest Ecosystems in Germany and coordinator of IUFRO Task Force on Forest Adaptation and Restoration under Global Change. He has extensive research experience on forest and vegetation ecology, silviculture, forest and forest adaptation to climate change. We have with us James Reed. James is a scientist in the research theme Sustainable Landscape and Food Systems at Center for International Forestry Research, headquartered in Indonesia. James is interested in inter and transdisciplinary research approaches that attempt to better understand the dynamics and potential synergies and trade-offs within tropical socio-ecological system. We are still waiting for Rene, actually. I hope he will join soon. Rene is a senior associate for the Global Restoration Initiative of WRI, USA. He has rich experience of designing and implementing different landscape management plans with multiple ecological and economic goals in various countries. He now directly involves, interestingly, on country-led effort aiming to restore directly 50 million hectares of degraded land in Latin America and Caribbean by 2030. We have with us Ida Nadia. Ida is a social scientist by training and currently a PhD candidate at Michigan State University, USA. Part of her research interests and experiences are understanding the human dimension, that is very important, aiming to restore and conservation goals, mainly in sub-Saharan African countries. Ida's works portfolio includes natural resources management and governance, climate change adaptation and mitigation, livelihoods, and sustainable development. So I'm sorry, this is not my time to talk. So we're going to start the session, the discussion session. So our webinar program, we have divided into 3 major parts. First one will be a round discussion among the speakers, will be 25 minutes. And then we'll move to second round discussion with fewer questions, 15 minutes. And after that, we will have open questions and debate, and we'll take questions also from the audience. So here we start. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. And Rene is also with us, I see. Welcome, Rene. My first question is to Professor Andreas. From your task force, how are you interacting with forest, science, and people? Could you please tell us? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, and hello to everybody. I feel honored, and it's really nice to be with you. Yes, and concerning your question, perhaps some words about our task force. So task force is something different than the divisions or the other section within IUFRO, because this is an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research unit who tries to interact with the different divisions and task force and disciplines. And it turned out that the topic of forest landscape restoration or managing forest landscape is a very interdisciplinary topic and a very interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary issue. And due to this, it's very important from the beginning that we have about 50 or I think now 53 researchers in our group, in our task force, which are dedicated to different kinds of disciplines, from silviculture to social science to economics and to educational issues and so on. So it's a really broad, and due to this, we have this interaction. It's more or less within the group. That's quite clear. I'm, from my educational background, a vegetation ecologist, and so I'm coming from the natural science background. And from the beginning, I was thinking more that forest restoration is more or less a technical issue, to look on the science to find suitable sites and to apply a certain technique to select plant material and so on. But more and more, due to the work and the interaction task force, I have learned that it's more and more a social, economic, and a political issue, because it's comparably easy to establish a stand or a plantation and so on, but it's much more difficult to keep it over decades. So I guess the question how to keep forest landscape restoration sustainable over the decades, that is really the biggest issue and the biggest problem what you have. And due to this, social scientists and the link to the people, and especially to the local people who are the actors and interacting with forest landscape restoration, this is the most important issue and problem to solve.
Thank you, Andreas. Our second question is, as you mentioned, then socio-economic dimension is very important, and the issues are very important. So, considering changing social dimensions and demands in land use, what actions could increase adaptive capacity of forest land?
Yeah, I think there are two major aspects. One I've already mentioned is to really have a good idea about the requirements of the local population. So what are the requirements to landscapes, to ecosystem services? And it's very important to have this in mind, and also to have an idea about or keep the flexibility in changes of the social demands or requirements of the society, because there could be, political changes, there could be also social changes. So it's very important that all kinds of, I would say, landscape elements are managed and it can be used for the local population in a proper way, and also for the future. And the second point is really a political dimension. I've learned that land tenure is a very critical issue for forest landscape restoration. So who is controlling the land use in the moment? Who will control it in the future? So I think land tenure and the inclusion of all the political actors, which are important to the development of landscape and dynamic of landscape, and of course also the requirement of the local populations are the most critical issues for, and to address with action these problems and to solve these problems, and I think it's the most proper way to increase the adaptive capacity, because I would say forest landscape restoration is also a kind of increasing social adaptation or social adaptive capacity, not only the adaptive capacity of the ecosystems.
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree with you. We have some similar experience doing research in the tropics. The land tenure is also very important, and I do agree with your all concern. Thank you so much. So I'll come back to you again. So next question to James. James, based on your very rich experience in many countries, what would be the major prospects of restoration that you think?
Thanks, Syed, and thanks for having me. I guess in terms of prospects, well, I suppose to start with, I should say, oftentimes I don't work directly on forest landscape restoration, although I work on similar issues. So maybe I'm giving a slight outsider's perspective, if you like. But in terms of prospects for FLR, I think that on paper, at least, the prospects at the moment are very good. I mean, I think the approach of FLR has come a long way in recent years, and it's clearly gaining a lot of momentum, and that's been seen by the Bond Challenge and the New York Forest Declaration, and obviously most recently the subject of this webinar, the Decade on Restoration. So the momentum is there, and the political will appears to be there, and there's been a lot of good research published recently in terms of the benefits for whether it's the environmental benefits or the climate benefits or the economic benefits in terms of creation of job opportunities and income from forests and non-forest products. But I think the issue is this, that's why I say it appears that the commitment's there. Actually, there seems to be a disconnect between the commitments and the action. We see so much in terms of pledges, whether that's Brazil pledging, I think it's 12 million hectares, Ethiopia 15 million hectares. So all these huge pledges, which, like I say, on paper is really encouraging. But I think that disconnect is what we need to address and make sure that when we are turning these pledges into action, it's being done in a sort of sustainable, as Andreas was saying, but also equitable manner. And I think a lot of past experience have shown us that restoration can happen, it can produce these benefits, but oftentimes it's associated with displacement of people or displacement of extractive activities. And so these are the kind of issues that we need to keep in mind and also consider whether we currently have the policies or the financing models in place that can actually make FLR actionable, attractive, or even financially viable. And I think René will probably have a lot more to say on that topic. But particularly in the capitalist world that we live in, that's a significant challenge. But like I say, the return on investment seems to be there. And I guess we also need to ask ourselves, as I'm sure we all do, what is the long-term cost, not just in terms of the economic cost, but the cost for everybody and the planet? What is the cost of not implementing FLR or really not addressing the drivers of deforestation and natural resource destruction over the long term? So yeah, that would be my kind of balanced argument for prospects and also challenges, I guess.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. So my second question to you, if you see policy to practice, how do integrated landscape approach sustain this initiative? If you can give some example from your experience in the field.
Yeah, so I think, in terms of integrated landscape approaches, sustaining FLR or sustaining themselves, I guess is two different questions. But the way I think of FLR and integrated landscape approaches, it's they're very similar things. I think maybe you could say FLR is a type of integrated landscape approach, or at least an integrated landscape approach could be an implementing pathway for FLR to happen. So I think that's, I guess, one issue, I guess, with FLR is, at least in the public perception, is it's often wrongly assumed to be just about planting trees. or reforesting. And actually, there can be multiple entry points to FLR or indeed to integrated landscape approaches. And so I think when you're talking about moving from policy to practice, there's these loops that you need to include not only policy and practice, but also research and the disconnect between those different spheres. And so I think Andreas has already touched on it as well. There's this real need for integration, and that's, I think, where perhaps integrated landscape approaches can help. I think certainly in terms of the work that we've been trying to do, we've been bringing together stakeholders from those different spheres and particularly engaging policymakers with local people. And then I think how you sustain that is obviously the challenge, because a lot of the projects that we're currently involved in and have been involved in the past are obviously funded through donor funding, and they're funded on short-term cycles. And we need to try and somehow move away from that, or encourage donors to fund longer-term projects. But there's also an argument that having those policymakers in these stakeholder forums, hopefully we can try to encourage them to kind of maybe make up the shortfall that's left when donor funding disappears. And I think, that's something that the integrated landscape approaches are trying to do. So it's a question of how you sustain, but also how you incentivize people to maintain that engagement. And I think, again, it goes back to, like Andreas was saying, having local people involved, ensuring that there's local leadership and ownership, and addressing issues related to, power relations, power dynamics, and trying to ensure that you're empowering local people to have a role in the process, and essentially monitor and evaluate progress towards objectives that they've bought into, essentially.
Thank you, James. Before going to Rene, you mentioned the displacement of people that is have to be concerned, right? So, I mean, you mean the displacement by the restoration program, or if you just make it a little bit clear?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been issues in the past, and there are still ongoing issues where we either try to protect existing forests or we try to establish new forests, and to do so, that means excluding people from what are their, ancestral homes. And of course, that's a serious human rights issue. And, that's the thing in these landscapes, that it isn't just a single entry point. You are dealing with a high level of complexity, and you need to consider, obviously the social, but the environmental, the governance, the political. There's a lot of different dimensions. One of them is certainly protecting and establishing local people's rights to land that they've perhaps lived on for generations, and lived on sustainably, I should add.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. So I'm coming back to you. So now to Rene. Hello, Rene. So what is the expected role that government and non-government organizations, including the international organizations, could play for restoration, based on your experience?
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity to be here with all my colleagues here and all the expertise they bring into the table. And apologize, I have some troubles with the internet this morning and then my computer, but now I'm connected with my phone, so it seems it's working, and I hope to stay here. If
no problem, thank you.
Apologize, but I will try to reconnect. But in terms of your question, I think there is a important role from governments and NGOs and organizations in general to drive this movement. One is, to facilitate, and I think that's something that has been done with some
hello, Rene. We cannot hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. No. Okay. So just saying that there has been some success in political will, and the organizations, NGOs especially, have supported a lot the trying to make these governments around the world to commit hectares. But as James said, that's just a political commitment. We need to go into the action. And now I think with the starting of the UN decade, it will be launched next week. It's very important to start moving the implementation in the ground. And in that sense, I think the NGOs and also governments have the commitment to, one is to unlocking policies around the sustainable use of landscapes. There are many policies that harm the environment and the people. And I think governments can start working on them to try to drive them and change it and eliminate these perverse incentives. On the private sector side, I think there is, if we want this to be sustainable in the long term, we really need private investment in that. And there is a good movement of private impact investors that are looking for this environment and social impact in the region, in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world. So I think facilitating how these private actors that might not know very well what restoration means, the role of governments and NGOs could be to explain, what are those benefits, not only the public benefits, but the private benefits to them. And there is economic case for some of those models, I think. One last thing is, it's very important to say that, the FLR process is just the means to reach, impact. We are doing restoration because we want better water or better quality, water security or food security, but it's not the end at cities, and it's not about just planting trees, as James says. It's beyond that. So the way we look at it, and that's why the concept is very broad. It's like the human body, that is a landscape that is the human body that is sick, and you want to restore the health of that landscape. So in order to do that, you need to do some things, but you cannot intervene all the human body or all the landscape. So just want to stop there.
Thank you, Rene. So, the restoration actually is a huge activities and then lots of dimensions to follow. So based on your experience, what do you think that would be the priority area of funding for restoration?
Well, there is a need for more implementation, so we need more business model, but also supply chain, a better supply chain, sustainable supply chain of certain commodities to be improved to stop degradation. When we talk about restoration, we cannot simply stop talking about degradation. So we need to improve food production systems so they can be more sustainable. And at the same time, I think the investments in new business models and restoration, new entrepreneurships and new companies that are looking into this. One last thing is, there is a lot of discussion about carbon markets and what is the role of carbon markets in restoration. And I think that could help also to bring additional resources for local people restoring and managing forests. But it's just a small piece, there needs to be other things that need to be done in order to scale the models. In terms of that's implementation, we need to invest a lot in monitoring too, because we want to see progress, but in order to see progress, we need to establish a baseline, and then we need to establish some set of indicators to monitor that progress. And those indicators doesn't need to be only biophysical ones like trees or tree cover, or it needs to be beyond that. It needs to go to socioeconomic ones. And then it really becomes really tricky and difficult. So that's why we need to invest on that. And of course, capacity building is very important, and at all levels, to transfer knowledge from the bottom up, and also to know, different technologies that can streamline the restoration process.
Thank you for the answer. So as we know that you are directly involved in the restoration project in several countries in Latin America and Caribbean. So could you please just tell us for our idea that how much fund would require to restore the 15 million hectares of degraded land in these regions that you are directly involved in this project for the next 10 years?
Yeah, I support, and I am part of the Secretariat of Initiative 20 by 20 in Latin America. And just in Latin America, governments have said that they committed around 52 million hectares to restore. of course, you know, if you see it as strictly 52 million hectares, it's very hard to see, you know, how we can do actions in the 52 million hectares. The way, I think the approach, the landscape approach itself, what it tells us is that we will intervene some areas in the landscape that are key, but we won't intervene every hectare in that landscape because it's not feasible, it's not possible. Even if you're just talking about planting trees or just about you know, some actions in the ground, it's very difficult to reach that scale. So we are talking about here from the 52 million hectares, maybe we can identify those 20 million hectares that are highly priority for the countries to achieve the targets, and then let's do actions there. And when I do, and I say let's do action, it means that the public sector needs to invest some resources through payment for ecosystem services, compensation systems, also laws and policies that avoid, you know, the illegality in forests. And in the other side, we need investments from the private sector, not just companies that are looking to restore land. So we need both. But I just want to point out that we think that this will mean to intervene the whole area. It's difficult. We need to do some things, but it's discrete interventions in the landscape that can benefit the landscape as a whole.
Thank you, Rene. Thank you so much. So now our question to Ida, as a social scientist, taking restoration from social perspective, what are the current emerging issues that you think need to consider?
Thank you, Said, for providing me this opportunity to share some thoughts with you and my colleagues on forest landscape restoration. With your question, I might sound repetitive of what Andreas, James, and Rene have already said, but I think it's worth repeating because those are really the emerging issues with forest landscape restoration. So my take is that this contemporary wave of restoration presents both some issues to address, of course, but those issues can be also seen as opportunities to seize in the sense that and there is common agreement that the current framings of ecosystem restoration kind of emphasize the complex socio-ecological character of natural resource management, especially at the landscape level, which is again true for the African rural landscape that I focus on. And the framings also underscore achieving both ecological and socio-economic benefits. So with that, I personally think that the obvious long-term issue or challenge is the one pertaining to conservation and development scheme. James already mentioned a bunch of them. And from my perspective, it is how to ensure coexistence of ecological goals and socio-economic goals in a defined landscape. And I think that how we embrace the complexity of resource management and with an interdisciplinary perspective, we focus on managing trade-off and synergies will be determinant for success and sustainability. Now, once we are aware of that, the practical issues that we might consider for landscape restoration interventions include a number of elements that I'm going to enumerate here based on my personal stock that I have taken on potential constraints that can hinder the implementation of forest landscape FLR interventions. So the first one is how to get right the restoration needs and objective by not only considering the biophysical or ecological status of a targeted landscape, but most importantly, by considering also the vision of the landscape that the different stakeholders that are present in the landscape share. And in that regard, there could be several objectives to be defined for multiple benefits. The second point is how to ensure adequacy of approaches or schemes and techniques and technologies to different land use type within a landscape and to different restoration goals that are defined. And with respect to technologies, especially how to ensure their adoption by local farmers, because they are the ones using those land management practices. And if it is applicable in a certain landscape, how do we ensure that farmers or local resource users are using those technologies, those practices, and potentially by understanding first what to leverage in terms of related social, cultural, or economic, and even institutional constraints. And a third point from my perspective is how to address some known but new governance challenges and institutional issues, including, I think Andreas and James rightly mentioned, tackling the resource right and tenure insecurity issues and meeting the governance integration that is required by forest landscape restoration intervention, because we have to agree, or at least understand, that when we mean forest landscape restoration, the scale is the landscape. And within the landscape, there are different sectors, different actors working, and integrating the actions for cohesive management is really important. So how we ensure that we can achieve that is one issue to kind of address. And the fourth one to kind of, I think the fourth one will be also ensuring adequate managerial skills and capability and knowledge, relevant knowledge needed for planning, implementation, including even stakeholder engagement and monitoring and evaluation. Those kind of skills are present, are in place in a targeted system. And that also includes the different mode of governance or the governance system that might be adopted, and what are the institutional arrangement and the processes to kind of realize that governance, governance model or form that has been chosen. So like I started to say, while we see those things as issues, I personally like to frame them as, as opportunity to kind of address. Those are long-term issues. Not only, they didn't come up with FLR, but they were there with even other schemes that in the past. So how FLR present that opportunity to again sit down and really address those issues from the bottom up. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ida. So actually, you already answered part of my second questions, but to be more particular, briefly, could you please tell us what do you think the communities, based on your experience, could play to cooperate this UN effort of restoration? What is the role that local communities could play?
Yeah, good. I will reframe your question. It's not about what roles community could play. I think it's very much about how we make sure that they are involved, right, in the diverse restoration undertakings. And my point here is that restoration should be community-centered or driven, and especially in managed landscape where you have those local communities who are, it's their land that are degraded, right? So how we put them at the center of our interventions for restoration will be really key. So, but I'm going to say that without really neglecting or overshadowing the importance of the ecological benefit that we all know, carbon offset, climate change, when we unpack the social benefits, they are about sustainable natural resource-based livelihood, right? Food security, which contributes in one way or another to socio-economic development and poverty reduction. And if you take much of the global South, including sub-Saharan African countries, both rural and urban livelihood and food security depends highly on land, trees, and forest resources. So the depletion of those resources kind of jeopardizes or threatens the sustainability of livelihood and also food security. So I think it's like a a natural restoring those degraded agroforested landscape becomes really a natural and implicit solution to secure sustainable livelihood of those communities. And as I do see that the importance of local community is well stressed in the relatively recent articulation of FLR and its principle, especially talking about stakeholder engagement and local participation in planning, restoration goals, strategies, and implementation activities will be really key. So, how we engage and we ensure local participation will be key for successful and sustainable forest landscape restoration. And when we unpack the stakeholders who are there, so that principle talk about stakeholder engagement is not only limited to NGOs, private sectors, or government actors. Its stakeholders also include local farmers, right, whose land are degraded. I've already talked about that, and who use those land techniques, land management practices as part of their own restoration efforts. Stakeholders also include resource users who self-organize, right, collectively to manage tree forests and land resources. It also includes local and traditional leaders who play an important role in governing local communities and including having authorities and power in the management of local resources. So how we engage the process by which we can engage all those stakeholders, not forgetting one. So who are there? Who is gonna win? Who is gonna lose? And what are the interests? What are the power relationships? Those are things to take into consideration. And there are much other kind of categories of actors that I might not know. So start from identifying who those stakeholders are in a targeted landscape and really involve them in the implementation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I do also agree with you. So we have finished our first round discussion. Now we are starting the second round discussion, and we'll have only one question to the speakers. So my first question to Professor Andreas, actually, we partly also discussed this in our first round. So, however, from your perspective, Professor Andreas, what are the major constraints that you think to achieve the restoration goals?
Yes, I would like to answer it for the different spatial scales what we have. If you look on the international scale, I think James already mentioned the global activities or action like the Bonn Challenge New York Declaration, trying to restore 350 million hectares within the next years. And we have all these continental actions. And I see also in the background of Rene, you know, the 20 by 20 initiative in Latin America, we have Africa 100. So a lot of initiatives on the way. But we know that forest restoration will need a long breath, so for perhaps decades. So it's very important to keep the attention high. So, and my dear colleague John Stentorf, he always talk about more the critical attention drop after a few years. So what about more or less the situation in 10 or 20 years? Will we have the same attention on forest landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration? And it's very important to keep it high and to keep the pressure also high. On the national or regional level, I would see that the major constraint could be bad governance. Bad governance means that there are emerging conflicts among stakeholder groups who are involved in land use, or there are hidden stakeholder or hidden actors, and so it's very important. Also, the question of what I already mentioned, like land tenure or unclear situation, unclear development of landscapes, and I think this is very important to have here clear regulations and a good governance. And then on the local level, I guess what's already also mentioned, besides all this question of participation, also capacity building. it's very important that the local people are linked to the forest restoration actions in the localities, because then they will take over responsibility. Otherwise, if people from outside are getting in and doing the restoration are getting out, I think there's a big chance there will be no development of responsibility for the forest landscape restoration areas. So, and we launched in our task force also a global survey on the pros and the cons and of forest landscape restoration. And it's interesting, sometimes they're quite technical issues which are really critical, like for example the lack of plant material and the lack of nurseries. So even if the people are willing more or less to restore forest landscape, they get no proper plant material because there's no infrastructure of nurseries or plant breeding and so on. And it's also very important if you think about to restore, for example, or doing restoration activities with native plant species, also in terms of ecological restoration. And in this kind, we need also infrastructure, we need capacity building, we need education, and we need participation. I think these are more or less on the different scales, the biggest constraint, what I see.
Indeed, I agree with you. Thank you so much. Just so my next question to James. James, what methodology could assist restoration efforts? I'm asking this because you have done some very exciting research and you have used several methodologies, including some new invention. So what do you think, which methodology could assist this restoration effort? You can say from integrated landscape perspective. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Syed. Yeah, I think when it comes to the methodology, I mean, there's a lot of parallels between integrated landscape approaches and FLR, like I said before. And of course, a lot of the methods are transferable between the two. I don't know if there's so much that integrated landscape approaches could transfer to FLR. I think the methodology for FLR has developed pretty well. I mean, there's been a lot of good work in terms of design frameworks or design principles. I think that's same for landscape approaches as well. I guess one thing I could say is that it kind of frustrates me a little bit that we're all kind of working towards the same things, but we're working in slightly different, I mean, I don't want to call them disciplines, different approaches even. And so there's so much research being developed, and I think we need to do more to learn from outside our own individual approaches. So FLR is one, landscape approach is another, but there's also, you know, sustainability science, there's resilience thinking, there's, I don't know, knowledge co-production, transdisciplinarity. There's all of these different kind of related approaches that all need to do a better job of learning from each other. But it's incredibly difficult when there's such an abundance of research and methods coming out. It's an impossible task for anyone to try and keep up with. But maybe, like Ida says, we need to look for opportunities here, and you know, maybe there's an opportunity for someone somewhere to have some kind of repository of bringing together all of this related research. I mean, systematic reviews is one way, but even those I feel are limited because a systematic review on FLR might miss a lot of the work coming out of knowledge co-production or sustainability science. So there's certainly an opportunity there to do something in terms of, you know, developing better models of knowledge exchange, if you like. But in terms of the actual methods, going back to the original question, I guess what I would propose and what we tried to do in our team is always start from the point of view of the principles. And I think, you know, the FLR principles, they've got the 6 principles, and they're basically a subset of the 10 landscape approach principles developed by Jeff Sayer and colleagues. And I think they're a really good starting point for any implementing agent for either approach. Build from those principles the type of evaluation approach you want to apply, and then you can start thinking about the methods. And in terms of FLR landscape approaches, you're like I said, you're dealing with large landscapes and high levels of complexity. So the traditional approaches of impact evaluation don't really apply. I mean, I think having a counterfactual for a 3,000 hectare landscape is very hard to come by. I know there is a lot of work being done in terms of having models and supercomputers that you can plug in 1 billion variables or what have you. I'm not going to pretend I know much about them, but that's one option. But I think the option that we tend to go for is more a theory-based evaluation. So you bring the stakeholders together and you build a theory of change. And so you get stakeholders from, policy, research, practice, community members, tribal chiefs, whatever those stakeholders might be, and you get them to do backcasting exercises, develop baseline scenarios, and also do projection work. So that could be done through simulation modeling or other means to try to, essentially produce a desired state for their landscape where they can find some consensus on things that need to be done to build towards a more sustainable and just future. And then you've built the theory of change and you can build the methods and the evaluation approach from there. And I think, in any of these processes, again, it goes back to the issue of the long term and the short term. And, there's obviously trade-offs there, but I think you need to have a strong emphasis really on process indicators and not just what is the long-term outcome indicator, because obviously they're dynamic systems, things are going to change, new opportunities and threats will emerge. And so, like the principles say, again, there needs to be this adaptive management. So a process and a governance system like we've talked about, whereby you can revisit and reevaluate the targets and the progress being made. And I guess, I know, like I said, a lot of work's been done on design frameworks. Like John Stanturf was mentioned. I know his work, and I think the principles, like I mentioned, but I think maybe there's been a lack of emphasis on governance and on the social indicators. And I think, it's important if a lot of these things have multi-stakeholder platforms or decision committees or whatever we're calling them. And I think it's important to have some system in place that's monitoring the effectiveness of that governance structure itself. And I know some colleagues at C4 from the Peru office, Ileana Monteroso, Anne Larson and their team, Juan Pablo, they're all working on these issues of how to ensure participation is equitable and how to improve inclusion and issues associated with gender and power dynamics, of course. And then I think finally that this issue of adaptive management, we also need to remember that there's so few good examples. And I think that's been mentioned a couple of times today for landscape approaches and FLR of how things have been done really well. And so I think it's important to always acknowledge that it is a process of learning by doing. And we need to be brave enough to accept that mistakes are going to be made, and there's not always going to be a perfect outcome. And sometimes it might even be better to have a number of suboptimal outcomes rather than this striving for this, really crazy, unrealistic triple, quadruple win scenario that's just really not that realistic. So I think there's a lot to be gained actually from documenting and elaborating on the trials that take place, and this idea, if you like, of kind of failing forward, making mistakes, but being able to correct those mistakes as we go on.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Thank you. So, Ida, you have experience in sub-Saharan African countries, and if you take lesson from your field, from your experience, what do you think that the constraints of restoration and their supportive policies can be? Can you tell us very briefly, because you're a little bit out of time? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again. Before joining you guys here, I was in another conference where the AFR 100 actually partnership meeting, countries are reporting on the progress and pointing out some constraints that they have been experiencing. And glancing quickly at, like, I think 10, more than 10 countries, the constraints boil down to capacity building, lack of resources to really bring translate the commitment into practice, and also knowledge exchanges, those kind of things. And also governance. Governance has been mentioned a lot of time, especially when there are a lot of different actors interacting. And linking that to my research and what I've done recently, it's focusing on the governance integration. How might we realize that at the landscape level? So at this point, I pretty much agree with James that we can borrow from lenses from other disciplines. So I borrowed from the institutional literature and using polycentricity lens to see what kind of interaction, what kind of governance system can be put in place in context. I studied the context of Malawi, and what are the processes that governance processes that needs to be in place to achieve such integration. And it boils down to enhancing cooperation among actors, and ensuring equitable resource allocation and coordination and conflict management and institutional externalities management. Those processes of governance need to be put in place within a well-defined governance system. So to be short, I will just emphasize again the governance integration and assuring that policies from different sectors, whether agriculture, forestry, or land resources, are aligned. And because there are a lot of interconnection and interdependencies that are not seen, but doing restoration, they kind of cancel out each other. So make sure actions are, oriented cohesively with an integrated system of governance is important. I think those are the constraints.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you so much. Yeah. So next question to Rene. What policies you suggest that could make the cooperation stronger between organizations? That I mean that government, non-government, and international organizations. Thank you.
No, thanks for the question. I think that there are, one of the key elements is, how to increase implementation, because, we have big commitments and we know that need to be real and need to become real. And in that sense, in terms of policies, one of the most promising policies that we can, it can support cooperation, but at the same time support implementation, is incentives, public incentives for restoration. And when I say public incentives, there are a variety of them, but one of them is the payment for ecosystem services. As you might know, Costa Rica has a vast experience with that. Before, the restoration topic was in the movement, and it's not perfect, of course, but it's working, and it's a policy instrument that basically pays you if you conserve or you manage or you reforest your area. And that has been an entry point for other organizations from the private sector and also NGOs to collaborate in that. From the NGO side is to collaborate on strengthen the technical side of the program. And from the private sector side, it's a leverage of money. So if you put $1, I can put $1. So it's something that is really bringing together, linking into the same goal that is increasing implementation. And I just mentioned Costa Rica because it's the famous, but we have several one of those programs in the region. Mexico has a good program on hydrology and payment for ecosystem services. Guatemala has a program that is not called payment for ecosystem services, it's called incentives, forest incentives, but it supports restoration and in the landscape scale. And it has been very successful. And remember, some of these are very small countries. I am from Guatemala, for example. I can tell you that for these countries investing $50 million per year on this, it's a huge thing. And they are not doing this just because of the trees. They are doing this because this brings dynamizes the rural economies and also brings together other partners that are there. Just a secondary thing is what we call regulations, which is, it's very difficult to change laws because they need to pass Congress, and even in developed countries, that's very hard to do it. It requires a lot of negotiation, but there is a lot of regulations that are, the operational part of the law that doesn't need to pass Congress. And if you change some things there, you don't need to change the law. You just need to, the law is general enough. But if you change some things there, you can streamline and eliminate barriers for restoration. One example in Latin America is in one country, a law that basically, if in the regulation says, the law says you have to plant trees close to the rivers in riparian forests, riparian zones. And then the law says, just that. But then the regulation says, once you plant the tree, you cannot do anything. You need to conserve the tree forever. And that might sound really good, but in reality, the local communities wants to use some forest and I mean, timber and non-timber forest products sometimes and manage it sustainably. So that's actually a disincentive. And just changing that language, which doesn't require to change the law, can have a big impact and can bring together many collaborators. Thanks.
Thank you, Rene. Thank you so much for the nice explanation. So we just now finished our second session. Now time for open question and debates. We already questions from the audience. Actually, we already got some questions here. You also can see. So first question is from our division head, Sandra. She asked, regarding the role of the private sector needed to accomplish restoration initiatives, as mentioned, how to balance and manage the need from local communities and the private sector investments. So I think that this question is more suitable for Rene. Do you think you can answer?
Yeah, just a quick thing there. I think, when we say private sector, it's very broad. And I think one part of the private sector that is the impact investors, when I say impact, because it has that last name, and the impact investors are looking for social and environmental impact. That doesn't ensure 100% that they will do the right thing. But I think that means that they have safeguards, so they need to take into account and negotiate and talk with the communities in order to achieve their investment targets. That's a small part of the investment ecosystem, but there are a lot of companies, private companies. Private sector could be, just one people that has a lot of land and has crops. And for them, I think the key, if we are talking about communities, more like, aggregation of different landowners or indigenous communities, I think one point that Andreas mentioned, the governance part, if you want to have a equal negotiation between private sector and communities, there has to be a strong governance in the communities, and so you can negotiate and you can have clear the clear needs that the community has for this specific area. The problem is, when you have a lot of problems with land tenure, for example, that happen a lot in Latin America, Africa, and then that creates this disaggregation, and then conflict is inside the communities. So then when private sector comes in, it could happen that divide and conquer is the strategy. So then it's easy, to implement things. But I think that's something that we could avoid by improving governance, which is not easy, by the way.
Thank you. So our next question from the audience, Julian. This question is, do you think that it will be relevant to integrate local knowledge to landscape restoration? How can we proceed? I think this is more related to Ida or James. James, do you think you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just trying to read the question. Do you think it'd be relevant? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it is relevant and completely necessary. I think the recent report from the Rights and Resources Initiative is really a must read, and it sort of emphasizes the need to establish rights for Indigenous people and local communities. Not only really from the moral basis, but also from the economic basis. They go into the fact that the cost of displacing those people would actually be far greater than establishing their rights. And, you know, but beyond that, obviously, these people have been managing these lands, and they have a lot of knowledge that perhaps we're not exposed to. And I think this also goes back to the capacity building issue, which gets raised a lot. We need, you know, capacity building in these tropical landscapes in the global south. But I think, you know, we also need to recognize that it's capacity building on both sides. There also needs to be some kind of 360-degree capacity building, so that it is a co-produced process, and we're learning and building together. Obviously, the issues come in when you say, you know, you want to, you know, obviously establishing rights is one way, but getting their voices heard and, you know, building empowerment is a completely different issue. And I think how you get their voices heard in these decision-making platforms is really challenging. And perhaps that's where research can do more, you know, to try and determine whether their voices and concerns are being heard and whether their knowledge is being incorporated into decision-making and policy-making ultimately. And certainly research can, you know, go out and speak to these people and find out if the people who are representing them in these multi-stakeholder platforms are representing them adequately. Because of course there's going to be issues of elite capture, and, you know, you may well have the village headmen or the farmers association lead there, but, you know, they could be elite themselves. So we need to ensure that we're speaking to other people within these landscapes to ensure that they are being fairly represented. But yeah, in short, I think absolutely we need to be integrating local knowledge much more than we are doing.
Thank you, James. Our next question: are we ready to the UN decade on restoration? Very nice question. Would we need 1 decade to prepare an actual restoration decade? I mean, that question, I think Professor Andreas, you may answer this question. Is it okay for you?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. I think it's a certain a symbol to say we have this decade of restoration, and we could discuss also about, you know, that perhaps also these quantities, 300 million hectares of forest restoration until 2030 could be perhaps a pitfall, because we're talking more on quantities, but we should also discuss about qualities and how to sustain with the action. But I think on the other hand, I guess on the political level, I guess you need something like you know, very clear and quantitative goals to be achieved. So I guess it had a certain sense, but this is in a certain way we should go deeper also from the perception of science, and say, okay, this is not the only goal, and it's also not the only decade now, or the next decade. So I think it's really a long-term effort and a long-term activity, and it's something like I would say a common change of perception of how to deal with landscape, how to develop landscapes, and land use. So I guess it's very important not to stuck more or less on just the decade or the numbers or the figures. But let me say also some words to the question before. In our task force, we have launched a database and a survey where all local people can put in their experiences with successes and failures with forest landscape restoration. And this is in 13 or 14 different languages now. And because I think also we have this problem with the language barrier. So the people, and not all of the local people are able to understand and communicate in English. So it's very often needed that we also address and integrate also with the people who are not able to communicate in English. And for this, it's also important to have really multilingual platforms and databases where people can report in. And as James already said, it's very important. We do need the local experiences. It's not just a one-way capacity building from science to the local people, but because often they have very much experience and knowledge, which all the other can also benefit. So it's something like exchange of knowledge and experience among local people and more or less science or managers and so on.
Thank you, I'm just either do you have any question? Yeah, I can see you raise your hand.
Yeah, not a question, just like to comment on the same question on local knowledge and even the question before. It's how we use the right amount or the right level of bottom-up and top-down approaches will be really relevant. Wrongfully, we see a lot of emphasis on tree planting only as being forest landscape restoration. But when we look at what are the other practices or the other technologies that local communities use themselves to restore the land, that's an aspect of local knowledge that can be brought on board in the design and implementation of forest landscape interventions. So not showing to the local people that, okay, here we are coming from outside to show you how to do restoration. No, what are the ways in which you are already restoring your perceived degraded land, and what knowledge are you putting into it? Let us know about it and let us incorporate those ones in our strategies and in our national strategies. So I think that's a key point, a key element to emphasize. Luckily, looking at some of the national strategies that have been developed, we see not only emphasis on tree planting, but also other local farmer-informed practices, and it has to be that way. And there's also focus or emphasis on entrepreneurship. We need skill, those kind of things. There are entrepreneurship within people, within local people, and it's the way in which we show them that you are almost already doing this thing. The capacity building can just only reinforce what you're already doing. So co-producing the strategies and the approaches and the techniques that to be used will be really important.
Thank you, Ida. So our next, and I see the last question from the audience is saying, what do you expect from the UN decade on restoration in next 10 years? What would be an outstanding outcome and a realistic outcome? I think the three questions together. Professor Andreas, do you want to please kindly want to answer these three more questions? I think is the last one, if anyone. Thank you so much. Before this, Rene, do you want to discuss something?
No, Andreas, please, I can go after him.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not also easy to answer, but I guess I'm not sure if we really reach the goal to get this 350 million hectares of forest landscape or landscape restored until 2030. So I have no figures in mind in the moment, but I guess if we will touch, I would say 150 million, I think this would be really a good achievement. But I think it's I don't think it's really it's just difficult to say what is realistic. And as I already said, we have also to discuss about the quality of restoration and the sustainability, and not just more or less, because in 2030 or in 2030, then if these million hectares will be just established stands or established forest ecosystems. So it's very important that they will be there even also then in 30, 40, 50 years. So I think it's difficult and to really have a realistic view on it.
Oh, thank you. Rene, please.
Just some thoughts from Latin America. One of the things that we really want to achieve, and I think it's possible, is to reduce deforestation. We have high rates of deforestation in the region, and the cheapest restoration is avoided degradation and deforestation. Basically, if you don't degrade, then you don't need restoration. And I think, since we are looking at the landscape, conservation is part of landscape restoration, and I think we would like to maintain the forests that we have, especially in South America, Central America, and parts of Mexico. The other, and I think it's realistic. I mean, if we do efforts and really, it goes hand in hand with food supply systems. The region produces a lot of food for the world, Europe, United States, and we need to produce food, but sustainably, better ways to produce food, so we don't degrade the forest to expand the agricultural frontier. And that means also restoration. What we need to do with the sugarcane producers so they can produce the sugar that we all consume, but in a more sustainable way. So let's restore the riparian forest that goes into those properties, for example, and I think that's something that is feasible if we work with them together. And the third thing is, the rural economies. For me, I come from a very rural country, but what I hear many times is the farmers said, and people that is probably old said, my sons, my daughter, they don't really want to keep managing the land. They want to go to the cities and do some new things. And I understand why it is, because it feels so negative. It's low wages, a lot of work. How we can create business models that are very attractive for young people, so they can work on the land. It doesn't have to be something that you see it as, if you go there, it will be a very bad, it will be not a success in life to work in the land, which is, I understand, I understand the points, but I think we need more entrepreneurship in that side, and as it happens in the software industry, for example, something like that, but for restoration, making it attractive for people, young people with energy and big ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Rene. Yeah, Professor Andreas, please.
Yes, I would like to emphasize one point Rene mentioned. I guess it's very important that forest restoration cannot replace the preservation of primary or native forests. So it's very clear, more or less, and the first idea should be to preserve and to keep as more forest or primary or natural forest as possible. But if we have degraded landscape, then you can discuss about, or you should discuss about, forest landscape restoration. But it's quite clear that it's also a question of quantity. You cannot say, okay, we're losing, for example, 10 million hectares of native forest, and this is completely replaced by 10 million of restored forest, because the forest ecosystem functioning and the structures will be not the same, and will have to develop within, I think, centuries. So it's really quite clear that forest restoration cannot replace preservation of existing forest.
Thank you, Professor Andreas. Yeah, I do agree with you also, Sam. So if we are almost at the end of our session, Let me check a bit if we have can take one more question from the audience. If no, there's no question from the audience. So is there any other concern of our respected speakers you want to raise here, please?
Just you know, for me, it's yeah, it's very good opportunity to be in this group of experts here. I just want to extend our invitation. We are making bridges with FR100 because, you know, we need to learn more, you know, between regions. We are not separated. We are pretty much suffering the same barriers. We have in 20 by 20 what we call it, it's task force, but it's really groups of communities of practices. So I invite you know, my colleagues here, but also people in the audience if they want to join. It's mainly focused in Latin America, but we have one that is looking to make these bridges with Africa, especially around monitoring. So and I invite you to be part of that. And it's voluntary. It's not. It's a community of practice in general, but very happy if you can have time to participate and interested, of course.
Thank you, Rene, for this very nice invitation. Yeah, so it can open the new opportunity. So we are almost end of time, and I see there's no more questions from the audience. So also, yeah, okay. So thank you, James, Andreas, Rene, and Ida, for your time to discuss very important thing. You know, webinar is really short, like we just hear like 1 hour, 20 minutes. So we try to address the most emerging issues, but also I know that some, of course, some are missing. So we can also address them in the coming webinar. And personally for me, I'm also involved in restoration projects. And also I learned lots from you, the new things. And I will, from our working party, will try to communicate with you. And yeah, thank you so much for your time also. I would like to thanks to the audience who are watching this webinar from YouTube, and thank you for the questions. So before ending the session, I have a small announcement. IUFRO Division 8 is arranging a webinar on landscape restoration with a special focus on Latin America. It will be end of the June, and then the exact time will be announcing soon. So thank you so much. Also our coordinator, Joel, thank you for your time. You're here, and thank you everybody. I hope to see you again, and thank you so much for your time. Yeah, so see you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.